welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and in this video series we have been talking all about the feasts of the first month. And then we get to Shavuot, or Pentecost, also called the Feast of Weeks. And people say, whoa, hold up, wait a minute. This is the feast of the third month. And we say, well, yes, we understand that Pentecost takes place at the start of the third month. However, the thing that we need to understand is the date of Pentecost is effectively set by the date of Yom Omer. So if we want to understand the Pentecost, the first thing we need to do is we need to take a look at Yom Omer. Now, to quickly review, but also to bring in a whole lot of new information that we didn't cover earlier, some of the things that we see about Yom Omer is it always falls on the first day of the week during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Chag HaShavuot. Now, if we think about the symbolism of that, it's very powerful, because Chag HaShavuot, that's where we're getting rid of any leaven from our lives. That's where we're getting rid of false doctrine, because false doctrine is sin. And people say, false doctrine is sin. Like, why would false doctrine be sin? Doesn't that seem harsh? We just don't know the right doctrine. That's a sin? It's like, yes, it is a sin. Because what Yeshua wants is for us to help him build his unified global ministry, or his unified global spiritual kingdom worldwide. That's what he wants. And we can't do that unless we have a single unified doctrine. Because can two walk together unless they be agreed? The answer is no. As we've seen time and again, as we see in many of our studies, a nation in Scripture is effectively a religious belief set. So if you have more than one religious belief set, you have more than one nation. And a nation divided against itself shall not stand. So this business about having the correct doctrine is extremely important. And so this is the context in which we need to understand Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. Because Yom Omer, the day of the wave sheaf offering, we're going to be making an offering during this Feast of Unleavened Bread, during Chag HaShavuot. And the whole purpose of this is to get rid of the sinful parts of ourselves and to be filled with Yeshua. So the Omer, the lifting up of the Omer, symbolizes Yeshua, who was the first among many to be resurrected. He's also symbolized by the Omer offering, and when we lift up the Omer, we're effectively lifting up Yeshua. You say, well, how do we lift up Yeshua, and what all's involved in that? Well, there's many parts to it. The things that we can do is that we can imitate Yeshua, and we can learn to walk even as he walked. That means we need to study and know his doctrine, and not the doctrine of the Pharisees, not the doctrine of the Sadducees, not the doctrine of the Messianics. We need to be careful about what fountains we drink from, because it makes a big impact on our spirits. But what we do is that we realize what John the Baptist said was true, Yochanan HaMatbil, John the Immerser, is that we must decrease so that he might increase. So we're lifting up Yeshua as an example so we can become more like him, so we can imitate him. So we want to learn to become less like us and more like him so we can manifest Yeshua and manifest his spirit in our bodies, literally by letting him lead and guide us in everything that we do. And we allow his spirit basically to have its way with us in everything. And in all of these many things, that's how we're lifting Yeshua up. That's how we're exalting and glorifying him, because the world can tell from our witness that we know he is worthy. So sometimes that gets their attention. Now, Yom Omer, on the early side of the 50-day count, with the barley. Now, traditionally, Yom Omer took place just after the Exodus, in Exodus 12, when Israel passed through the Reed Sea, or the Red Sea, the Yam Suf. So as this was basically a type of immersion. And we know that the whole business, we know that the wave sheaf also has to do with resurrection. So Israel was immersed, so to speak, as they passed through the Reed Sea, and then they were born again on the far side into a new life with Yahweh Elohim. And this is symbolic. The whole concept, the whole theme is symbolic of our renewed life. So we leave our old lives in slavery to the world system, and now we begin our new life, our renewed life with Yeshua and with his Spirit. So these are all things for anyone who wants to be considered as part of Yeshua's bride to keep in mind. So the bride is supposed to be refining herself like this for these 50 days, for trying to learn how to please her husband. And basically, according to tradition, this is what we're supposed to be doing from the time that the wave sheaf is lifted up. So we're doing this for 7 complete weeks, plus 1 day. 7 complete periods of time, and a perfect number of them. And then we add 1 day later to bring us back to the first day of the week, and that's when Shavuot or Pentecost is. But now we're going to see the symbolism behind them. So Shavuot or Pentecost, according to tradition, that's when the Torah was originally given to Israel at Mount Sinai. And one of the reasons is that Yahweh took Israel out of Egypt, took her out of the house of slavery and bondage, and then gave her his covenant. And the Torah functions not only as a covenant, it also functions as what's called a Ketubah, which is effectively a wedding contract. So, in the ancient Hebrew wedding tradition, the marriage is publicly announced at what's called Erusin, which corresponds to Shavuot. And the marriage becomes lawfully binding at the moment it's publicly announced. Now we're going to explain this and unpack this just a little bit. Now, but from the time that the deal is made, from the time the agreement is reached, the groom and the bride are then kept completely apart, and they're going to communicate only through the groom's best friend. And if we think about the spiritual implications of that, who is Yeshua's best friend? It would be the Spirit, and that's how he says he communicates with us. But so that's why Yeshua says in Yohanan or John chapter 14, starting in verse 16, he says, "And I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper, that she may abide with you forever." And we say she because in Hebrew and also in Aramaic, ruach is a feminine. So, and he will give you another helper, that she may abide with you forever. The Spirit of truth, meaning the Spirit of Torah, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees her nor knows her. But you know her, for she dwells in you and will be in you. He says, I'm not going to leave you orphans. I will come to you again. So when did he come again? Well, he came on the day of Shavuot in Acts chapter 2. He sent his Spirit to be with us then. Because it says, when the day of Shavuot had fully come, and they were all with one accord in one place, suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues, as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the set-apart Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues, as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there's some interesting things we need to see about this, speaking in tongues. And actually, we talk about this in more detail in our study about speaking in tongues in Nazarene Scripture Studies, Volume 1. There's the URL for those of you who don't like to use the web page navigation. But in that study, you can find out there's actually several different kinds of tongues, and learn which kinds are legitimate and which kinds are not. Thought we'd include that because we always get asked. But so let's recap. Let's take a look at this, at the order from the bride's perspective. How do things happen? Okay, so first there's going to be, according to the ancient Hebrew wedding ceremony, we have what's called shidduchin. So that's the match, and that takes place at Pesach. So basically what happens is you have the parents of the groom and bride, and they're going to make a deal. And once they have a deal, they're going to have a celebratory meal to confirm that, yes, they agree to this deal. But they're not going to announce it yet. They're going to wait. They're going to be certain. They're going to let things settle. They're going to sleep on it. They're going to take their time. So now the match is official at Shidduchin. And for example, we see in Scripture, we see the Pesach. But so, and that was the match between Elohim and Israel. So, but then what they do is like, they don't announce it immediately. They're going to have they're going to have a confirmation, celebratory meal. But then they're going to wait until after the Sabbath. And on the first day of the week, of the following week, they're going to begin a 50-day count up to what's called Erusin, which corresponds to Shavuot. And that's when they're going to make the public announcement of the wedding. So, and again, in Hebrew thought, the wedding becomes lawfully binding. So legally means man's laws. Lawfully means Yahweh's laws. So the wedding becomes lawfully binding when it is announced. So take 7 perfect periods of 7. Take 7 days, a perfect number. Take a perfect number of those weeks, 49, and add 1. Just be sure. Because when you announce that you're married, it's your word in Scripture. The words are very important in Scripture. I mean, the parties to the marriage are considered legally binding even though the consummation and the wedding week don't come until later. Now, in real life, it comes after the summer growing season, and then the harvest typically is when they do that. And then it corresponds feast-wise. In an example of the feast, it corresponds to Sukkot. So now we had a first fruits offering of the barley at Yom HaNafat HaOmer. So that began the Omer count. And then now there's a 50-day count up to Pentecost or Shavuot, and there's going to be a second first fruits offering. But it's not going to be first fruits of barley. It's going to be first fruits of the ancient black wild heirloom emmer wheat. It just grows wild in the land of Israel. So what we're supposed to do at Yom HaNafat HaOmer, we just brought a sheaf. But at Shavuot, we're going to bring enough wheat. We're going to bring 2 leavened loaves. So the way we present the first fruits is different. Okay, let's take a look at the commandment. It's found in Leviticus or Vayikra, chapter 23, starting in verse 15. So you can see for yourself. It says, so you shall count for yourselves. So counting is part of the commandment. You shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, meaning the weekly Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the barley wave offering, meaning from the day you brought the Omer, from Yom HaNafat HaOmer, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. He says, count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. So 49, so 7 times 7 is 49 plus 1. He says, then you shall offer a new grain offering to Yahweh. And we have to offer it. It's the first fruits of wheat. And what is wild, or what is coming ripe at that time, is the ancient emmer heirloom wheat. So what does this mean in terms of us? How can we understand, how can we use this information to help us understand the feast even better? Well, for this, we need to take the ancient Hebrew wedding model. So here you have phase 1, which is called shidduchin, or you have the shidduch, or the match. Again, from the bride's point of view, the match was made at Pesach. And then there was a private celebratory meal between both families confirming their covenant. So they don't make the announcement right away, but what they do is they wait until the Sabbath of whatever day the Passover fell in that week. They come to the weekly Sabbath and then wait till the very next day. That's when, according to the model, Yeshua is lifted up and the 50-day count up to Erosine begins. What happens when you reach 50? When you count 48, 49, 50, and you're finally there, now what do you do? Well, according to the ancient Hebrew wedding model, now we are entering into the phase called Erosine. And Erosine is the public announcement of the wedding. As we mentioned before, the marriage becomes official and lawfully binding once it is announced at Erosine. And this is true even though the consummation may not take place for several more months. So in this model, the consummation would take place at the end of summer, and that's typically when the Feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, comes, is also at the end of summer. So to find out how Erosine turns into Nisuin, please see our series on the feasts of the 7th month. But so we take a look at the process. The families make their match and share their celebratory meal. That's Pesach. Then they wait until the first day of the week. Then they start a 50-day count to the announcement of the wedding. Then they count the 50 days, so the 7 weeks, 7 perfect 7s plus 1. And then they announce the wedding also at the start of a fresh new week. Everyone's relaxed, refreshed. Here's your wedding announcement. So that's Erosine, and they are technically married, even though the consummation normally doesn't come until the end of the summer, around the Sukkot Tabernacles time frame. So for those who are interested for themselves, if you're going to do Erosine, so no matter when you're going to do it, it's difficult if you do it on Shavuot day, but it's a very popular time of year. So the families make their public announcements, and ideally the bridegroom is going to give his bride a ketubah. That's a written wedding contract, and that's going to explain what the promises are, what the roles and the duties and the responsibilities of both the bridegroom and the bride, and it's also going to spell out any punishments for breaking the contract. And it's a perfect picture of the Torah at Mount Sinai. It's very clear once we understand what the pattern is. Yes, this was absolutely Yahweh's ketubah with Israel, because he gives us the promises and he tells us what will happen if we don't want to obey. And we were given an option. Yahweh sprung us from prison, sprung us from bondage, and brought us to the foot of Mount Sinai and gave us a choice. And we gave our I do's at the foot of Mount Sinai. Exodus or Shemot, chapter 19 and verse 8. All the people, all of our forefathers, answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. So we are now responsible to do everything of the Torah that we can do, even though we're presently in the dispersion. We talk about that in our other video series about the Melchizedekian Torah. If you want to know, there's lots more good details in a chapter called The Wave Sheaf and the Pentecost. It's contained in the Torah calendar study. A lot of it is technical. If you want all the technical details, or if you're trying to understand what's wrong with the rabbinic count, what's wrong with the messianic and Karaite counts, and these kinds of things, the Torah calendar is going to give you that good global overview. You can put all the pieces in place. And for the rest of us, praise be to Yahweh. We are called to the Feast of Weeks at its appointed time, 50 days after Yom HaNafat HaOmer. Let's remember to keep the count, and let's remember to keep purifying and refining ourselves so that we decrease in our own eyes and he is elevated in our eyes. Shavuot Sameach. Shalom.